Hello, everyone. For those who haven't been to this podcast before, my name is John Patrick. I'm a retired professor, amazingly, of biochemistry and pediatrics. Somewhere about 25 years or more ago, students picked up throwaway lines, and the net result in the end is I've spent most of the last 25 years talking about ethics, culture, faith, and public policy. Because if we don't get all these three on the same page, as a culture, we're toast. It's been a fascinating journey, and I hope you find what I've got to say helpful. So far, you appear to think that way and that the numbers are growing, so thank you for that very much, I think. I'm quite happy to retire too, but we'll see. Today, I want to talk to you about some of the things I've been reading. In fact, most weeks you will find the stimulus for what I have to say has been what I've read in the past week. But I want to start, first of all, for this one, with some beautiful words. They go like this: O Lord, unto whom all hearts are open, all desires known, and from whom no secrets are hid, cleanse the thoughts of our hearts by the inspiration of your Spirit, that we may worthily love you and adore your holy name. That's from the Anglican Book of Prayer, Common Prayer. It's the opening of the communion service. The reason I love it so much is that we have problems, don't we? Every week we screw up in one way or another. It doesn't matter whether we're Christian or not. It's an ongoing experience. And I only have to ask you one question. Unfortunately, I can't see your faces, but I know what will happen. If I was able now to say zap, and immediately you have a bubble over your head like a cartoon character, and all your innermost thoughts are going to be on display for the next, how long shall I punish you, a week? What would you do? Where would you hide? That is everyone's experience. No one denies it. Everybody would laugh at them if they did. That is the human experience, what Tom Sowell calls the tragic vision. Our politicians who think are constantly feeding us utopian dreams that they can't possibly fulfill. They can push it a little bit one way or the other, and then usually they push it too far, and we get some ups and downs, but it carries on. So that prayer is an incredibly honest way to look at the world. Now, one of the things I've been doing over the last few, I suppose it's months now, is to look at the Sermon on the Mount, because people who knew me immediately asked when I started this, why aren't you doing that? Well, the Sermon on the Mount has been central to my life, and it was pure gift. I take no responsibility at that level, only give thanks. It did change my life dramatically, and judging by my emails, it does the same to other people, which is wonderful. So the way I've been trying to open this up, going through it bit by bit, is to show you what our Lord is doing in the Sermon on the Mount. It is, after all, his first essay. What's the word I want? That's the wrong word. His first entrance into the public square. We only have the lecture notes in the Bible. It's clearly full of aphorisms and other things that would have to be interpreted and explained to the people who are listening. I also personally believe that it was Matthew's turn from the secular pursuit of money to the pursuit of Christ, which became his life. He was doing well. He was a tax collector, a good trade to have in the ancient world. And I like to think that he ripped Christ off at some point, charging him more than he had any right to. You can still find that at borders in various parts of the world. So he was used to angry responses. He didn't care. He had the power. But when he did it to Christ, he got a look of pity. He hadn't been pitied in years, so he never forgot it. And when Christ became, in the Jewish eyes at the time, a traveling rabbi, there was no way he was going to miss. So when he heard he wasn't too far away and he was doing miracles, he said to his sidekicks, "You can rip me off today. I'll leave the shop to you. I'm going to go and listen to this man." So I like to think he arrived in the village where Jesus had been healing the evening before. But when he got there, they'd already disappeared from the village up a hillside. I've been to the spot where they say it happened. It could be, but that's not important. And I like to think of an out-of-condition Matthew arriving just in time to hear the first words. Blessed are the poor in spirit. The very first words. Here was a man who was very successful. He was making good investments. He had a nice house, etc., etc. No friends, of course, or only the friends that money will buy. No friends at all. And we're working our way through what Jesus was doing in this sermon. And the first dozen verses are the sermon in embryo, so to speak. And the Beatitudes, which are all have to be interpreted, expanded, are, in my view, it's not mine. I mean, you find it all the way back to Augustine. This is character formation, Jesus style. If you want your life to be straightened out so that you can be more peaceful, joyful, a better life, this is the way to do it. And the first thing is poverty of spirit. Now, you'll have to go, if you're new to the podcast, you'll have to go back and find the others, but very quickly, the review is always worth doing. Poverty of spirit I take to be facing the truth about yourself. It's not good news from our point of view, but Christ says, the moment you become that honest, I've got you. You're coming to me because I am the source of all truth. But he says, it's not a straightforward path. I'm not bringing you a rose garden. The poor you will always have with you, and in the world you will have trouble. He never made any bones about that. Utopian dreams are not going to happen here. That's further off. And they're not dreams. Utopia, heaven, is the objective. But there's preparation work to do. The second thing is to be given the gift of repentance, to be genuinely sorry for the errors in your character, the flaws in your character. I mean, we can't do that. It's not a human capability. We have to ask for it as a gift. And Luke in the Acts of the Apostles describes the fact that when Peter went to the Gentiles for the first time, they were given the gift of repentance. That's what convinced them that this wasn't just for the Jews. Most of the Jews never agreed with them. But that's what happened. And that, says Jesus, you will be comforted. And even that has a sting in his tail. Comfort Jesus style is not something soft, warm, like a puppy that they're constantly introducing into universities now to comfort the students who can't bear hard thoughts. It's a terrifying situation. But comfort Jesus style is driving you into battle, but under his command and with his presence. That leads to the next thing, which is realizing this is good and being honest about the change in your life. Blessed are the meek, those who recognize that they've given their life to Christ and he is now in charge and he accompanies you as long as you remain open to him. And he says they will inherit the earth. Now, the question is when and in what way. My usual response to that is to say, just consider Princess Diana and Mother Teresa. They died at almost the same time, but who was the richer? I think it's Mother Teresa, isn't it? So that's the kind of riches he's talking about in earthly terms. The ultimate riches, the earth, will be the renewed earth, the second coming. So the word translated meek is a beautiful word. It's used to describe a horse that is broken in and trained and ready for battle. It's a lovely metaphor. And that leads to the next one, which is hungering and thirsting for righteousness, for a better world. And he says, you will do it. We'll come to this a bit more in what I'm going to talk about primarily in this bit of the talk for this morning. So we'll be backtracking at that point. That leads then to mercy, and you get mercy in return. It leads to a new vision, the ultimate vision being achieved with purity of heart, when, as Kierkegaard brilliantly puts it, purity of heart is to will one thing, and that is thy will be done. That makes you an unusual person, hard to get at, because the goods of this world are no longer as important as they were before. But when there's trouble, as there always is in academic departments, the Christian ought to be the person that they turn to in order to mediate between the warring parties, because mediation requires somebody that both sides trust. It's not the art of a deal. Real mediation is the bringing of peace, to be peacemakers, as Christ puts it. And then he goes on and says, oh, and by the way, now you're in for suffering. Blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. He repeats that one in a very interesting way, which I wish many of our churches would start their Sunday morning service with this reality. He says, blessed are you when men shall revile you and persecute you for my name's sake. Not because you've done anything wrong. Rejoice and be glad. He is commanding rejoicing, therefore it is not a feeling. We can't if it were a feeling, we couldn't control it. But this is not. This is rational rejoicing. He says, you're going the same way I went and the prophets went. You're in good company, and your reward in heaven is real. That's why you rejoice. That's why throughout history, martyrdom has brought into the Christian's life at that moment an intense experience of that joy. So that what got to Paul when he was Saul was watching Stephen die, and he wasn't even feeling the stones. He could already see his master and Lord. This is the early centuries of the church. It was martyrdom that grew the church. It always has. And it always will. So that's rational rejoicing. Two reasons: good company and reward in heaven. And then he goes on and he says, you are to be the salt of the earth and the light of the world. You don't have to go back for those, because I'll spend too much time on this area again. I love it. But they both need development, what it means to be salt and what it means to be light. But then what he does next, which we're in the process of slowly going through. I've just been told that my mic was in the wrong place, so the previous recording is not the highest quality, but probably adequate, and you can find it all in back podcasts. So my apologies. Hopefully this is better. Now, to talk about Torah. The Jews thought then, and they think to this day, that if the Jews kept the law perfectly for one day, Messiah would come. And what Jesus is doing in this chapter 5 of Matthew is turning their world upside down, if they can see it. The law is not a means to be good. The law is the way that you find out that you're not good. You only have to think about that for a moment to see how profound it is. What he does in the rest of chapter 5, is that he takes some examples of the law. We've been for a few already, but killing, adultery, divorce, promise-keeping, which is where we've got to, and how you deal with the world around you. And in each case, he turns the law upside down. When he comes to killing, we all think, well, murder, yeah, you deserve to go to prison at least, probably to be executed. But he says, that's not the worst form of this. The worst form of this is, from his point of view, is when you live in what you call a community and there are people for whom you have no respect. You see, most murder is emotion, apart from professional killings where they've lost their soul completely. But in your everyday life, if you do commit murder, it's probably the nearest and dearest to you who will do it in a moment of anger. And Jesus says that's a moment of anger. But he says if there are people in your church, for instance, to whom you never condescend to speak, now your heart is turned 180 degrees away from mine, and you're on your way to hellfire. Whoa, wow. But it's a recurrent theme in the Sermon on the Mount. Christ says, I don't look at your actions. I look at your intentions. Hence the reason for starting with the prayer from the Book of Common Prayer. O Lord, unto whom all hearts are open, all desires known, from whom no secrets are hid. He knows it all. So that's where you start, rationally. And so when it comes to promise keeping, he says they had a very complicated system of swearing, not foul language, but rather saying, if you make this kind of promise, you have to keep it. And they were sort of graded, some almost like playing chess with some pieces having more power than others. And Jesus says that's absolute nonsense. He says, let your yes be yes and your no be no. Anything more than this comes from evil. What he wants in his people is that everybody know that when they say something, they will do it, and when they say they won't, they won't. One of my friends who died 2 or 3 years back, who was the co-founder of Augustine College, currently in mothballs, said, if he said, I will do something, you didn't need to, it would be done. You didn't need to chase him, remind him, or any of that. He was that kind of man. That's what Christ is looking for. And of course, nowadays, the biggest problem in the world is, or one of the biggest problems, is corruption, which is inevitable if you don't believe there's anything beyond this life. And as we believe it less and less, we will become more and more corrupt. We will try to control it by technical means, like monitoring everything. And then you get to the nonsense where last week a woman got put in prison in Scotland for something she'd posted on the internet, which was in the heat of the moment and foolish. And to make space to get her in, they let a violent person out. I mean, we're totally mad. Any normal environment would have said that was stupid, wasn't it? But it's not criminal in the sense that the hate speech crowd want it to be. Hate speech will only make things worse. We've got to be able to speak what we feel. Freedom of speech is central, otherwise the whole world becomes uninterpretable. That's where we're headed. But how do you do business? It gets harder and harder. There isn't a contract that can be written that some clever lawyer won't find a way round. But if you're a yes means yes and no means no person, you don't need all those lawyers. That used to be the way that it was done. When we first arrived in Ottawa in 1980, I got dragged into the Rotary Club because they heard what I was doing in Africa and they were interested, and they ended up supporting me in that. So I couldn't really say no. And it was actually very interesting because it was the oldest club in the city, I think, and it met in the Chateau Laurier in those days. Doesn't anymore. And of course, mainly business folk, not entirely. But the older guys, they told me of an Ottawa that was passing away. They said, 20 years ago in this city, if you didn't keep your promises, you didn't do business in Ottawa. Just think how much money that saves. The Jewish diamond trade is the same. They don't use lawyers. They know they're diamonds. If you don't come through, you won't be dealing in the diamond trade. That kind of integrity is so important, and it creates an environment in which other things can happen. So Robert Fogel, I often mention him because his book, The Fourth Great Awakening, was the first time I saw a Nobel laureate, in this case, talking about the fact that trust will be the limiting factor for the 20th century. He was a Nobel laureate in economics in Chicago, the world's most famous department of economics. And around 2000, he realized he didn't trust his students in the way that he used to. Cheating everywhere is endemic. There are even some cultures, students from some cultures, who say, well, it's your fault if we cheat. You should have, if we can find a way around it, then we're clever. They have no understanding of what's going on in their lives. If you take that view, where that will take you, then they complain that corruption in their society is a problem. Of course it is. You're corrupt already yourself. That phenomenon is relatively recent for many. Once a few centuries of Christendom have passed by, a lot of that disappears. Because the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. I can say to any medical group, which is my normal, has been my normal community with whom to interact until this podcast was started by Craig, now I suppose approaching 2 years. I could say to them at the beginning of Grand Rounds anywhere in the world that something like this: how many people can you trust in your environment? And is it increasing or decreasing? It's decreasing. What about, just rationally, think about this statement. If your doctor believes he will be judged for his behavior after death, does that make any difference to you? Does that increase or decrease trust? That's a no-brainer. And that was the insight that the Hippocratic physicians 2,500 years ago had. They had no treatment that worked. It wasn't going to be until the 1860s that going to the doctor usually meant that you lived a little longer rather than a little less, which is what happened until then. But not on purpose. It was just that, as always, medical treatments can be bad as well as good, but people like treatment rather than no treatment. It's very odd. So that requirement for transcendence, of course, is also present in the law. It was there. It's gone now. As one of my grandsons said to me, who's doing very well in the legal profession, is, Grandad, it's all procedure now. That's all. No philosophy of justice, just as no philosophy of medicine, and certainly no discussion of transcendence other than to treat it with scant respect, if any. There are some idiots who believe those fairy tales, they say. They are beginning to wake up, though. It's interesting, isn't it? There's a steady, it's more than a drift of very high-level intellectuals, particularly in the area of the hard sciences, who are beginning to realize that it looks as though the world is designed. The return of the God hypothesis, not even a hypothesis, but that's another story. So the promise-keeping that was going on in Israel, even in the days of Jesus, included promises that basically they were going to wriggle out of, and the other side often knew it, It wasn't what it should have been. It wasn't yes means yes and no means no. But you would be able to find within the context of your time people who did believe that, and you could trust them more. You were happier to deal with them. Now, most people have almost no one that they trust at the level that was normative not so very long ago. If you didn't come through on your promises, you got the title and the treatment you deserved. So that's where we've got to. The only way is to go back when you realize that you're not meeting the tests that Christ is putting up. You have to go all the way back to poverty of spirit, ask for help to understand what's gone wrong, be given the gift of repentance and work your way through. Then you go a bit further and again, you get shunted back. So it takes hours to get through the whole thing. In Africa, I know the Sermon on the Mount by heart pretty well. And in Africa, a lot of the villages I needed to get to required climbing a few thousand feet to get to the first ridge. Now, if you didn't get up that side of the mountain before the sun came up, you'd be utterly exhausted by the time you got to the top. And in order to keep going, I used to recite the Sermon on the Mount to myself, and it would last long enough to get me to the top. About an hour, I would think, because I would get side-shunted at various times. But what a wonderful thing to have in your mind. I didn't realize how good that was. Excellent. What you have really built into your mind for life. Because now I'm at the stage where I can't remember what I had for breakfast or if I had breakfast, because that's just pure recent memory. But I can still remember the things that are more important. Don't remember names very well. I'm sure many of you listening are well aware of what I'm talking about. But people understand, Mid-80s, you're allowed to have these little foibles, aren't you? So we've got to this point where we're looking at a much more ironic view of the world. That's what Tom Sowell writes about a great deal. The elite who rule us with their utopian dreams and largely no concern with the facts, no empirical respect. They are good language and they can make us feel stupid and small, but they don't know anything at the deepest level that matters. And they're willing to pontificate on almost anything. I listened to a piece on YouTube last night with a journalist that I respect a great deal and a couple of others, but they were talking about the COVID fiasco. And I was sorry to see they hadn't found somebody who actually knew a little bit about molecular biology, which would have been helpful to them. You don't help yourself by being inaccurate in some of your assessments and patently wrong. It was a disaster. And when you realize what we actually knew, and the people who were shut down because they spoke truth, who weren't mentioned, very sad. That's what happens. The elite level thinks they can talk about anything. Well, they need to be taken down a peg or two in many areas. Those who do know often say, I'm not going to say anything. They'll only make a fool of me because I'm not as articulate as they are. The elite who rule us are very good with words, and that's why they're so obsessed with controlling the narrative. They want the narrative to be one that serves them, not you. Whereas what Tom Sowell talks about in this book, just so that those of you who are interested in getting the vision of the anointed, he's talking about how it all came back. It's an old book. The Anointed versus the Benighted is one chapter. He's an absolutely brilliant man. I could listen to him for hours and go back and listen to it again and still get some more out of it. But he's journeyed the whole way. A black guy whose parents died when he was young. He got moved to New York and got a decent education when you could get that in the public system. Realized the problems with being black and that for some reason the blacks lived in the poorest parts of town. But when he was growing up, there were no gunshots in Harlem. They slept on the fire escape when it was very hot at night, or even went down to the river and slept in the park. And he describes growing up in that sort of situation and having a teacher who wouldn't take any nonsense from him, when you left school, said, don't come back to see me till you've got a PhD. He did, of course, do that, but not quickly. He got some experience of life, joined the Marines, became a firing instructor, also became a Marxist. What would you expect? But a very unusual Marxist, because he had a great deal of respect for empirical material. And as he worked through that stuff, he eventually became fascinated by economics, and he has been a naysayer and a critic that most of them don't like, and almost invariably he's shown to be right. So if you've never listened to him, go find him. The Hoover Institute Uncommon Knowledge is the best website I know for hour-long interviews with Tom Sowell, done by a beautiful interviewer, Peter Robinson. The two of them are a great service to the Western world, except that they're not as widely known as they should be, but they're growing. They're growing. And the young are finding them, amazingly. And young black men are finding him and loving him. They found a hero that's a real hero, somebody they can't completely emulate, but they can follow. And they have a tragic view of the life. He says that one of his commonly repeated phrases, in this life, there are no ultimate solutions, there are only trade-offs. Got it? Only trade-offs. And you push it too far one way or the other way, then you get into trouble, you have to rethink. But when the vision of the anointed takes over, you get things like Lenin and Stalin and Mao and Pol Pot. I mean, it's astonishing, isn't it, that totalitarian rule with a utopian vision, which is what the left always has killed more people than all the wars put together. It's astonishing. And yet they still go and say, oh, well, it wasn't done properly. No, and it's never been done properly every time we tried it. When do you realize what that means? We can't do it. And that, of course, is what the problem with the Sermon on the Mount. Christians don't like it because its standards are too high. They look upon it as somehow, well, it's not possible. Of course it's not possible, because they haven't understood what he's doing. Even Paul, at the end of his life, he said, I don't look back, I press on towards the mark of the high calling of God. Now we see through a glass darkly, then we shall be known as we are known. Then we shall know as we are known. Then we will be like him. So what Christ is putting in front of us is how the law as a teacher, if it was allowed to work its way through, how it would work. But of course it doesn't. It is pre-cross, pre the solution. But he's making it clear to us, look, you don't have a problem with knowing what right and wrong is. Everybody knows that. Children know it. Before they can parse a sentence, they can say not fair, which involves a whole host of metaphysical wonders. But there it is in your children, your grandchildren. Wonder at it. Think of Gerard Manley Hopkins' lovely line, Christ plays in 10,000 places, lovely in eyes and lovely in limbs, not his, to the Father through the features of men's faces. But I think the primary men that we look at is very generic, it's children. Children have this. And that's the innocence of children that is being destroyed by the faculty of education and its nonsense. Christ said, if you damage these little ones, you're better off with a millstone around your head and being cast into the sea. What we're doing to children is beyond forgiveness. At one level, only divine forgiveness can do it. It's horrendous. In the one group of people when I was doing active pediatrics, the group for whom I had the most complete and abject reverence was the people who did the child abuse work. I could not do that. It's got nothing to do with education. Very educated people abuse their children as well as the poor. In fact, the poor probably do it less. Yeah. So what's going on in the Sermon on the Mount is showing us just how big the problem is. But there is a solution. And Christ is not in a hurry. He says they will have to wait to understand. I mean, we're only talking about a couple of years, but it's coming slowly to them. Peter realizes quite quickly when some people walk away because what Jesus is saying is too difficult. Christ says, "You're going to leave too?" And Peter, impulsive Peter, says, "Where can we go? You have the words of life." And that is true. Those that seek find. It takes time. Now, as this story has been pushed aside, we have in effect cut off a layer of understanding that we used to have in the Western world. Some parts of the world were never privileged to have that level presented to them. There's that wonderful story of Hudson Taylor getting to the Western China and getting to a village and starting to tell the story of the gospel. And the people listened for a while and then they said, "Stop. We have to go and fetch someone." And they went to fetch the wise old man from the village, who was a Buddhist, of course, of some sort. And he listened to what was being said. And when Hudson Taylor had finished, the old man said to the people, "Didn't I tell you that there was a story like this out there?" And then he turned to Hudson Taylor and said, "How long have you known this?" And Hudson Taylor said, 2,000 years. And the old man shook his head and said, "Why did it take you so long to get here?" That's what I had to learn when I went to Africa. The first time I went to Africa, I didn't want to go. I knew a lot about malnutrition, and the missionaries that we'd met said, "You have to come and help us." And my wife, as usual, pushed, and we went with my kids. The best thing that ever happened to our family was those years we went to Africa every summer. And I've been privileged to be part of a group that wrote the definitive protocols for the treatment of severe malnutrition. But I knew there was no data showing that it was actually making any difference in Africa. So I didn't want to go. I wasn't arrogant enough to say people have been doing nutrition education in Africa for 30 years and nothing to show for it. I don't do the same experiment expecting a different result. That's Einstein's definition of idiocy. So I could at least show them that it could be done, and how it could be done. But I knew that it didn't transmit. I could train my children. They could do it. We could take children who hadn't grown for a documented more than 6 months and grow them in the summer that we were there. So what I didn't appreciate and what was going to be shown to me was the area of Africa that we love is the one where the horrible things are happening at the moment. Kivu has been hammered for 25 years and the world takes no notice. So I did the work that I did, and then I was confronted by the failure when I came back after a year. What I'd set up wasn't working quite clearly. And so I was sitting around trying to think about what was going on instead of being busy saving lives, which is what my good wife wanted me to do. And I said, well, I need to think about this. These people love Christ. The gospel came in the 1930s, and they remember dancing in the streets with joy when it came. But they only sing, and they haven't been taught. Services on Sunday morning last for about 3 hours, and I've heard as many as 11 choirs sing in one Sunday morning service. I mean, it's music, and they love it. Not entirely for wrong reasons, but it doesn't have the depth that's necessary to build a Christian character. My wife said, well, why don't you do a Bible study with them? So I started one. and a miracle happened. I had a translator walk 1,000 miles to get to me, and if that doesn't stop you in your tracks, I don't know what will. And they loved it. And in a very short time, I found myself teaching Deuteronomy 6 to 6,000 people out of doors. We didn't have any electricity, but they had a row of D cells that was, about a yard long. I only had to do it in English, and Mapendo had to turn it into the local language. But that made a difference. Within a day or two, one man said to my wife, "I've changed the way I look at my children, because Deuteronomy 6 is what has to be taught by the Father to the children if you're going to flourish." That's an incredible statement to make. So, at the present, we're losing that. We used to, when I went to school, when my wife went to school, the Bible was read in school, so that level was there. It was routine, but it still meant that the biblical story was put into the minds and hearts of children. And that bears fruit years later. At least the vocabulary is there. Now the vocabulary is gone. Biblical illiteracy is rampant. It's difficult under these circumstances to make things better. But once I'd done that, the Africans didn't want me wasting my time seeing children, seeing patients. They wanted me to teach. I can't explain what it feels like when somebody wants you to teach for 3, 4, 5 hours a day Scripture. They're hungry. They will be blessed in due course, but my goodness, they're going through hell at the moment. I don't understand that at all. But as Lewis puts it in the Narnia stories, when asked whether Aslan is good, Mrs. Beaver says, "Oh yes, he's good, but he's not safe." Now, so what made the difference in the Western world? It didn't happen quickly, did it? Let me read something to you, which was in the National Post for, which day was it now? Last Saturday the 1st of March. And it's in the issues section, and it's Nigel Biggar, who's a prof from Britain, and the title is In Defence of the British Empire. He's a real scholar. And to give a talk like that, well, he was cancelled, of all places, at Regent College. I hope they repent and quickly, but freedom of speech is important. But this is not just a question of freedom of speech. It's a point that needs to be made that you are ignorant. The angry warriors, the decolonializers are very selective. The only colonies they think existed were the ones from Europe. How could you be so ignorant? Well, because we don't teach any classical history. This is the way Nigel Biggar puts it. As a form of political organization, it has been around for millennia and has appeared on every continent. The Assyrians were doing empire in the Middle East over 4,000 years ago. They were followed by the Egyptians, the Babylonians, and the Persians. In the 6th century BC, the Carthaginians established a series of colonies around the Mediterranean, followed by the Athenians and the Romans, and after them the Byzantine rump. Empire first appeared in China in the 3rd century BC, and despite periodic collapses, still survives to today. From the 7th century, Muslim Arabs invaded the east as far as Afghanistan and the west as far as central France. They didn't bring peace, they brought a sword, by the way. The 15th century, empire proved very popular. The Ottomans were doing it in Asia Minor, the Mughals in India, the Incas in South America, the Aztecs in Mesoamerica. In North America, the Iroquois reconquered the St. Lawrence Valley in the 1600s and expanded westward. There was a lot of war between Indian tribes. The worst ones, of course, in terms of their violence, was the Comanches, who basically ruled Texas and beyond, described by one Oxford historian as running a vast slave economy. Tom Sowell also talks about the fact that 3 or 4 tribes in Africa were militant herders, the Zulus being the most famous in the south, but they kept all the other tribes under their thumb, and they ran a slave trade. The slave trade across the Atlantic, the slavers went only to the coast, and even going to the coast, they got killed by malaria far too often. They were buying Africans from Africans. The Muslims did it on an even grander scale on the other coast, and they went halfway across Africa to collect slaves. And it was castrated the men so the genes didn't contaminate Muslim society. The politically correct, angry social justice warriors don't know any of this. So obviously they can't come to any proper understanding. Bigger goes on to talk about what happened in Britain after the 1660s, because it was remarkable. Yes, the British Empire is the one that takes the most flack. You even get people referring to British colonialism as being equivalent to the Nazis. And Queen Elizabeth was the same as Adolf Hitler. I mean, you've got to be pretty blind to do that. But what happened was the world changed. It was the British who were the first to ban slavery. In fact, they first effectively banned it way back in the 12th century under Anselm. So slave trading in England was not acceptable. And after the 12th century, it didn't happen there. The slavers just took it to Ireland, of course. The Dutch also got rid of it around that time. And in the 18th century, it became a cause associated with the evangelical revival. And the British spent a significant proportion of their total naval budget for 200 years to get the slave trade off the seas. And they even went round the other side of Africa to do it. The people making all the noise rarely know anything of this. And also this week, so it's worth reading that article. It's worth having it around. So National Post last Saturday, bigger. But I also read this week a beautiful article by a woman called Louise Perry, who actually tells us indirectly that she's not yet 30. She has educated herself very well, or been blessed with a very good education if somebody made sure she got it. But she's talking about civilization and the fact that modernity is pressing the self-destruct button, and she wants them to stop. Here's what she writes. As a civilization, we are running on the fumes of the accomplishments of the 18th, 19th and 20th centuries. They gave us electricity, sanitary engineering, antibiotics, and asepsis and antisepsis first, vaccination, rail transport, the airplane, the computer, the theory of evolution by natural selection. She overstates that one. We haven't been back to the moon in 52 years. It may sound triumphalist, but the contributions of Britain and the British diaspora to this era of innovation cannot be understated. All the innovations listed above can be credited in whole or in part to men of British descent born between 1700 and 1900. Benjamin Franklin, Michael Faraday, Joseph Bazalgette, Alexander Fleming, Joseph Lister, Edward Jenner, George Stephenson, the Wright brothers, Charles Babbage, and Darwin. Darwin I wouldn't put in that list, but that's for other reasons. But what she's making is an important point. Faraday is my favourite in that list because he had no formal education. What he did have was an immense curiosity and creativeness. And I'd noticed in Africa, something happens as they grow up. We had an occasion when a helicopter from the Swiss helicopter mission landed in the area. In the next few weeks, the little boys, the 7 and 8-year-olds, were making models of helicopters out of bits of wire and sticks and everything else. Some of them were very clever. But their elders have all lost any incentive to do that sort of thing. The drive has been taken out of them somewhere. It's there, but it didn't get developed. And that's where we need to put a lot of effort. But Louise Perry goes on to look at one other thing where we need to make a big effort, a huge effort, actually. She points out that the total fertility rate drops. And in fact, if you look at data from elsewhere, once a society gets a per capita income of over $5,000 a year, it appears the fertility rate always drops. That only happened relatively recently. But now we've reached the stage where the whole of the Western world is not reproducing itself. And places in Asia are not reproducing themselves. China and South Korea have amongst the lowest fertility rates in the world, around 1.1, 1.2, and 2.1 is replacement. Now, the only people who are not doing this are people like Orthodox Jews. I think they're having about 8 children. Israel has got a figure of 4 for fertility rate. Interesting, isn't it? They're not alone. The Amish, they're reproducing. And evangelicals, we have above replacement. We're closer to 4 than 2. But if we did a bit more, we could have a lot more effect. Orthodox Jews, if they go on as they're doing, are going to be a very significant part of American politics in a relatively short time, 2050. These are exponential changes. There are people beginning to talk about it in proper ways. You can find them if you look. There's one from Sweden who does it brilliantly. Doesn't deal with the sociology of it at all. But South Korea and China, very productive up till now, but they're in a demographic plunge from which I don't think it's possible to come back, and the experts appear to think the same. So what do we do? Well, one of them is, and I'm glad to see my grandchildren, my children, and now my grandchildren are doing it, get married, have children. So I have 22 grandchildren and 6 great-grandchildren at this stage. Don't worry about what you'll do later on as far as the girls are concerned. Do things in university that you enjoy doing and that stimulate your mind. Avoid at all costs any woke course. If you can raise a family and bring them up well, there's going to be endless jobs that are interesting to do later on and not silly ones like sitting on a laptop and trying to design courses which teach children in kindergarten that they don't know whether they're a boy or a girl. We're in a crazy world, but there's hope. That article, by the way, is in this edition of First Things, which is December 2024, and it's called Modernity Self-Destructs. I thoroughly recommend it. We're up to more or less an hour at this stage, so I got to put one thing at the end. Now, those of you who were listening last week, I left the last bit hanging. What do your kids really need to know? And I haven't got time to do it this week either, but I'll give you the list. The first time I used this list in a lecture was at McGill, and I couldn't believe when I got back to my office in Ottawa that there were emails asking me where it came from. The answer is I don't know, neither does anyone else, but a list like this appeared somewhere in the Levantine area, between Jews and Greeks and the like. And it's this: you must be able to have a reasonable answer to all these questions if you're going to live a functional life and have a secure family. Where did I come from? Why am I here? We all feel that. That's why the young men take to Jordan Peterson like they do, because here's someone, instead of telling them that they're nasty people who are always practicing male oppression, he says, don't take any notice of that, but get your act together. Do something. As the lady I've been reading from, and I missed that out. Let me just read it, because if I can find it, I might not be able to find it. Oh, no, I can't at the moment, but in there somewhere. She says this from a woman under the age of 30. She says all that stuff that she listed was largely done by men under the age of 40, when they're wild and they'll try anything and do anything. And that leads to progress. Michael Faraday built the first electric motor in one day because he saw something and he followed it up with the energy that that age group can do. And we're suppressing it or making fun of it or what. Laptop jobs will be taken over by AI almost for certain, and good riddance, Then we get back to doing things that the computer can't do. So, why am I here is the big question. And where am I going? Being ready for death is important. Everybody used to know that I'm ready. I annoy my children sometimes by saying, if the good Lord sends me an exit ticket, I don't think I'll go to the hospital. That's not euthanasia, that's acceptance, by the way. Then you go on to the more practical ones. You must be able to talk about death and suffering and injustice. Medicine doesn't have any philosophy of medicine. The law doesn't have any philosophy of justice. What we want, says Leff, is to be simultaneously perfectly ruled and perfectly free. That is, at the same time, to discover the right and the good and to invent it. Can't do that. Doesn't work. That's where we're at. That leads to the last three, which the university's forgotten. What can I know, both positive and negative? That's critically important. Then that knowledge has to be translated into serious thought so that you can develop serious ethics. What can I know? Therefore, what ought I to believe? Therefore, what I ought to do. So I hope I haven't ruined your week. Send me an email, especially critical ones are much appreciated because they make me think. I thank you for the encouragement I get fairly regularly now, and it helps. So have a wonderful week and make some progress in the direction of those 9 questions. See you next week.